mic. Check, check. Oh my gosh, it's working like a
check, check.
Yes.
Check, check, check.
It's beautiful.
Is that good here?
That's it. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yay.
Oh, I love that I don't have to
No, you don't, and I hate that
never
movement.
sniff the microphone. Oh, these are new.
You're a pro. You've done it before.
I've done it before. Right. Never sniffed the microphone. So gross.
I interviewed one person. Their mouth was so dry that all you could hear on the microphone was like the clicking and popping of the inside of their mouth. And I was like, this is disgusting. I can't even put this episode out. It was so gross.
That's so scary.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Different Leaf Podcast. I'm your host, Britt Smith. I'm very excited to be launching the podcast version of the best cannabis culture journal out there, Different Leaf Magazine. So I started working in radio in 2017 when I first moved to Boston, and in 2018 I got into the cannabis media scene with my first podcast, Blunt Talk. Joining me for our first episode of Different Leaf is someone who, much like me, moved from mainstream media into cannabis media. He's the former publisher of Take magazine, and he's now the editor-in-chief and CEO of Different Leaf magazine, Michael Kusek. Michael, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Brett.
Good. Nice to have you here.
Nice to have you here. I'm very excited that you are going to be hosting our new podcast.
I am equally as excited. So this is not my first time doing cannabis podcasting, but this is the first time for you starting a cannabis podcast. What made you want to take it from magazine to audio?
Well, I think to expand the audience, and you know, when you start a print magazine, especially these days, people think you're out of your mind. But I could go on for several hours about why print is still a very viable medium. And why it's a really good medium for cannabis in particular, I think, right now. But also, you know, being a print magazine, you need to have some sort of digital footprint. And
right.
There are some really tough realities about publishing online that make putting words online very hard to make profitable. Mm-hmm. But I think that podcasts, that playing field's still a little bit level out there. And I also think there's a space for the kind of podcast I think you're going to do. And so that's why I'm excited about helping make that happen.
Yeah, same here. So what was it like from you? This is not your first magazine. What was it like for you to go from the regular mainstream kind of topics to something that's focused on an illicit substance?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, my last magazine was an arts and culture magazine called Take that covered New England. And when that was winding down, I was looking for another project, and I didn't know if that next project was going to be a magazine. I didn't really know what it was going to be.
Right.
And then I ran into a friend who's a cultivator in the space, and we had really a great conversation about the law and what it meant, in particular for our hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts, where I live. And that was a really interesting, fascinating conversation, and I kind of walked away from it. And about 6 hours later thought, oh, I wonder what's out there in cannabis media. Mm-hmm. Because I thought, it might be a good business decision if there was a space out there for a new magazine. I didn't know at the time how crowded it was.
Right.
You know, I knew sort of High Times.
Did you have to do a lot of research on what else was out there? What they
were doing? I did. And I did a fair amount of research kind of over the long term.
Yeah.
But my initial research that made me say, okay, yes, I want to start a cannabis magazine was actually really fast. I went to a couple different newsstands around where I live. I bought everything I could get my hands on. Mm-hmm. And I sort of split it up into three piles, and it was sort of the legacy media, like High Times. And then there was another, you know, kind of smaller pile that was sort of really aimed at a much younger demographic.
Yeah.
And then there was a really giant pile of B2B magazines, business to business magazines. So you want to make $1 million in cannabis, mm-hmm. you know, lighting for indoor grows. And what I immediately sort of hit on that was missing was, having just recently turned 50, was where's the magazine sort of for the new but older smoker? And so that's when I really started to dig in and do research. And I think that was the space that I wanted to fill. Something smart, well written, and beautifully designed. And with the new industry growing in Massachusetts, I thought it was a perfect time to sort of test something out in the state of Massachusetts.
Yeah, definitely. And so now you're on your third edition.
Yes, third issue's out.
Third issue is coming out.
And then we're already working on our fourth.
Right.
So our medical issue is out now. And we're starting work on our spring issue, which will be about how legalized cannabis is changing culture.
Yeah, wow. That's a very broad topic there.
Yes, we've got a little bit of everything in that spring issue kind of coming up. So that'll be really exciting. But it's been very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of the day-to-day stuff in creating media that is the same as my last magazine, scheduling photographs, tracking down writers, editing pieces, that sort of thing that's very similar. What is different is, going to convince a bookstore to sell a magazine about cannabis.
Yeah, so that's kind of where the space is still looking to grow is... where do people allow the magazine to be sold, and who allows it to be on their coffee table in their house? And...
Yeah, it's very true. One of the things I have somebody that I sort of go to, somebody who's been a friend of mine for a number of years, and she was like, I want a cannabis magazine I can put on my coffee table, and I was like, well, I can do that. Like, I can create that, but. Definitely when we were looking for bookstores to sell us in Massachusetts, I had a conversation with somebody who buys magazines for a bookstore, and he's like, oh, well, our crowd is older and they wouldn't want that. The assumption was that because it was cannabis, it would be youth culture, because that's a young person's thing.
That's a really interesting assumption to make, that it's so skewed by age, because really it's not.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I sort of, kind of unsuccessfully explained that this was actually a magazine for, 45 up consumers who might be coming back to cannabis, and that this would be something that would be very interesting to them. But I guess perhaps the tastes at that newsstand were a little bit more, a little less adventurous, shall we say.
And what year was it that you were doing all of this research and starting it up?
I started working on the magazine in January of 2018, and we put our first issue out in the summer of 2019.
Was it hard for you to find writers and editors who had the kind of cannabis knowledge that you're looking for?
Yes, and that continues to be a challenge.
Yeah.
Because of my last magazine, I had a network of really great creative people that I could tap in terms of editors and photographers and illustrators, but having writers with a really good background who had a really strong depth of background about cannabis is challenging.
It's quite a niche thing to be interested in at the moment. Yeah.
I've definitely been approached by writers who may, want to write about cannabis but don't have a lot of experience in writing professionally.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of that is making sure that the writers that you have working for you reflect the diversity of the industry.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that's also challenging just in general, especially as a small startup publication. I'm doing my best to get the word out there about that I really want our creative staff to be reflective of the diversity in the industry. And so anybody who wants to write can always reach out.
Hit it up.
Yeah, hit us up.
Yeah. So it's been quite a journey from you going from like the mainstream media and switching over to cannabis media. And now moving from one medium to the other, moving from print to audio.
Oh, I know.
And really starting to expand things here. And I've been on a very similar journey to you. So I started in mainstream radio, and now I've gone on to cannabis podcasting. So, I think that we've both found what we're good at and what our niches are, and then infiltrated the knowledge that we have about cannabis into that medium.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's been... And I think this is something you and I have both talked about is that there are bottomless interesting stories.
So many
good stories.
It's hard to pick,
It is. There are so many good stories that come out of this industry that just aren't about licensing or what new businesses opened.
Yeah.
That a lot of the people who work in this industry, many of them are medical users of cannabis, and that has brought them to the industry. There are a lot of interesting people with very fascinating backstories. There are a lot of amazing creative people who are looking at creating new ways to consume cannabis. It becomes very challenging to cover all of those and keep track of all of those. It's such a fast growing industry. And, one of the things that I really want to do with Different Leaf is to provide the best information so consumers can make educated choices about how they want to use cannabis. And it may be that they use it for a wide variety of the adult use reasons that you might want to use cannabis.
Yeah.
Maybe they're a medical patient. Maybe you're not a medical patient yet. At some point you may have a diagnosis down the road that would benefit from medical cannabis. And having that education and that knowledge in the back of your mind now is not a terrible thing.
I found that covering topics was such a broad field that it was difficult to pick out not just what my audience would be interested in, but also the people that wanted to speak on the record to media about cannabis use. This was one of the biggest barriers that I think that I found early on in being a cannabis podcaster, was that people didn't really want to go on the record admitting that they were medical users or that they consumed recreationally. And then there were people that were working in dispensaries out in Massachusetts, and I just wanted to talk to them to find out what it's like to be a bud tender and what kind of training you go through. And these folks were almost intimidated to discuss in depth exactly what they learned and what they knew, because it's such a evolving industry that I think that they didn't really want to be pinned down.
Right.
They wanted
tough to put a pin in it.
It definitely
sometimes.
is, yeah. And it's just everybody's still learning about this industry as they're involving themselves in it.
It is It's been fascinating to watch it, even since it's become legal in Massachusetts. And at a personal level, I think, my identity has been so wrapped up in arts and culture. Prior to doing Take, I still worked in arts and culture, so my identity is really imbued with arts and culture. And now I'm the cannabis guy.
Yeah.
And now people come up to me and are like, "Oh, my wife and I were in Denver and we blah blah," and I'm like, "I've known you for 25 years. You've never once talked to me about." Oh,
people are so much
consuming.
More comfortable now. Yeah.
And it's been interesting to watch that shift as it becomes something that people are more open to talk about, who might not be part of that sort of established cannabis community that's out there.
Have you found a lot of your friends are suddenly coming out of the cannabis closet?
Yes, yeah. Well, I knew most of them were already, I already knew kind of most. I knew who was. But
it's interesting to see who now feels that they've got the space to say, yes, I am involved in this.
Yeah, I am involved in this industry, or that I'm a consumer.
Yeah.
And I do hear that a lot more, oh God, I'm sleeping so much better now that I use cannabis, or it's definitely helped me with my creativity, or it's, a friend reached out to me recently. His mother's undergoing some treatment and he wanted to make sure that she was able to access it. And that is still something that people are looking at it as an option for a lot of different things in their life that they wouldn't have considered it before, because it would have been too difficult to procure before legalization.
I know a lot of people in states where it is not currently legal, in Dallas, Texas, and a friend of mine in Montana, and they would call me and ask me for advice on, if I'm buying it off the black market, what do I look for? And this is the only way that I can access it. And they can get access to some of the same products that we get out here, just, through illicit means. So they're still buying gummies and tinctures and vapes. And the demand for it hasn't gone anywhere.